Few tales are told of Hades, whose very name inspires fear and penitence, reminding us of the inevitable fate which we all share. I, however, mean to tell you such a tale. Listen carefully.
But first, we need to clear something up, because every time I post a Half A Press video, I get the same comments over and over asking what it means, even though I always have a whole paragraph in the description explaining it, which even starts with, if you're wondering what a Half A Press is, read this before commenting to ask. But maybe what you guys need isn't a paragraph. Maybe you guys need an example. So, consider Wing Mario Over the Rainbow.
Hades is a fast-paced roguelite developed by Supergiant Games. If you aren't familiar with Supergiant as a developer, you definitely should be. Before Hades, Supergiant developed Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, all of which were massively critically acclaimed games, and Hades is no different. Few developers, and even fewer indie developers, have the kind of track record that Supergiant does. Their projects are solid gold, which is why I had no trouble putting money down on Hades, even though it's still currently in early access. I basically regard the early access tag with the same sort of emotional revulsion I would give to a waterlogged corpse. Myself and many others have been burned time and time again by failed early access projects and outright scams, to the point where these days a developer needs to put up a pretty damn good argument to convince us to buy a half-done game. Fortunately for Supergiant, their track record is so good, their argument can pretty much be a list of their previous games, followed by a racial slur, and that would be good enough. Supergiant has a pretty unique style they bring to their games that make them immediately identifiable. This style tends to take the form of 3 trademarks: a striking art style with 3D models over hand-drawn backgrounds, excellent music, and great voice acting. All of these are present in Hades to great effect. This shouldn't come as a surprise, considering Hades is sort of a logical conclusion of Supergiant's work over the past 9 years.
Farewell to all the earthly remains. No burdens, no further debts to be paid. Atlas can rest his weary bones. The weight of the world all falls away in time.
To prepare for this video, I went back and played a little of Bastion and Transistor just to get a feel for how far Supergiant has come as a developer. Bastion was their first title, and you can already see it serving as sort of a prototype for Hades. The 3D models and animation are a little shaky, but the painted art style and the audio choices I mentioned earlier are here in full. The combat feels a little sluggish today, especially compared to the lightning speed of Hades, but it's a solid top-down RPG that sets the stage well, both for Hades and for what to expect from the games Supergiant would release later. Moving on to their second release, Transistor really steps up the game in terms of both 2D and 3D art, but it has very odd gameplay that involves sort of a fusion of classic top-down action games with a pseudo-turn-based system that I personally had a hard time enjoying. Transistor seems to be a very clear example of Supergiant experimenting with game design while simultaneously sharpening all of their creative talents. The visual art, as well as the music in Transistor, I think might be unmatched across all 4 Supergiant games. Finally, that brings us to Hades, which is sort of an amalgamation of Transistor and Bastion in terms of its design. The art, especially the character design, is very high level. But by far the biggest step forward Hades makes compared to its predecessors is its lightning-fast gameplay. Bastion and Transistor both feel sluggish in how they play, but in Hades, the player character's movements and attacks are so fluid that it feels like the game is taking place on an air hockey table. Dropping the gimmicks from Transistor and placing Bastion's gameplay on one of those boost pads from Mario Kart was an extremely good move on the part of Supergiant. This really feels like what they've been trying to do the entire time. It's like watching your favorite child finally get an A+ on a math test. For now, let's move away from the history and the art and get into some more technical design choices, which Hades also excels in. Hades is a roguelite. In case you don't know what that means, I'll explain it. In a roguelike game, you progress as far as you can without dying, and once you die, you're sent back to the beginning of the game, but you keep some resources that allow you to get stronger and try again. It's the halfway point between a traditional roguelike, where you die and start over completely from scratch, and a more traditional progression system, where you die and you move back to some sort of checkpoint. Roguelites are a bit of a challenge to work on, because you need to find a way to make their inherently repetitive nature fun rather than excruciatingly boring. Hades pulls this off through a variety of different strategies that I'll go over, the first being the general variety of gameplay. The goal of Hades is to escape from the classic setting of the ancient Greek underworld. The first choice you need to make is which weapon you're going to choose to do this. You start out with only one, but you unlock the other 4 fairly quickly. Each weapon has a completely different moveset and playstyle, which is going to have a massive impact on how combat feels. Maybe you want to go for a more general hack and slash build, so you pick the sword. Maybe you want to play a little more defensively, so you pick the shield, which can allow you to block and also offers some ranged attacks. Maybe you want the Call of Duty audience, so you pick the literal gun. The game also incentivizes you to use all of these weapons instead of just picking a favorite as well. You get rewards for clearing each area with each weapon, so you're going to want to mix up your choices. Now that you've picked a weapon, you need to pick which aspect of the weapon you're going to use. Aspects change the playstyle of each weapon slightly. Let's look at the bow, for example. The bow's basic version has a standard charge-up bow attack, and this large area attack. But if you take the aspect of Chiron, this moves to a more single-target focus by making it so that your area attack will instead shoot all of the projectiles at the last enemy your normal attack hit. Or you can pick the aspect of Hera, which gives you the option to load your spell casts into the bow and fire them along with your attack, giving you an easy way to focus on a cast build. Every weapon has at least 3 aspects, with a 4th yet to be introduced, and the spear having all 4 in the live version of the game. So this gives you a pretty big variety of options before a run even starts. Once you've chosen a weapon and picked the aspect of the weapon you want to use and start a run, things get even more complicated. There are 2 more methods for changing up how the game plays from this point forward. The first, most important, and main progression mechanic in the game are the boons you'll receive from the various Greek gods. Most of the major gods you'll remember from the Pantheon are here. You've got Zeus, Artemis, Aphrodite, and several more for a total of 10 gods. Each god offers some sort of a unique mechanic to add to a build. Of course, since this is a roguelite, you'll be receiving these boons at random as you progress through each encounter, so you never really know who you're going to run across when. Occasionally you'll have a run that is heavy on a single god, but other times you'll have a run like this, where you're using strong boons from several at once. Boons can affect your weapon's basic attack, special attack, as well as your dash and your cast. It's possible to build around any of these things, even the dash, which in most games would be considered exclusively defensive. Some boons offer something as simple as giving your basic attack a debuff, and others offer more playstyle altering options like doubling the amount of casts you have for your spell attack. On top of these boons, which offer a pretty hefty amount of variety, you also have these hammers, which will allow you to upgrade your weapon temporarily each run. These upgrades, similar to the boons, also range from something like this, which gives you a damage boost against armored enemies for certain attacks, or something like this, which completely changes the weapon's moveset. Let's look at the spear for an example of some of the more game-changing upgrades. The spear can be used either as a melee weapon with its basic attacks, or as a ranged weapon with its special throwing attacks. This hammer upgrade replaces your standard attack with a series of very fast jabs, allowing you to build primarily around the melee aspect of the spear, while this upgrade makes your ranged attacks ricochet from enemy to enemy, allowing you to primarily build around its ranged attacks. So, depending on what hammers and what boons you get during a spear run, you might be doing literally opposite playstyles with the same weapon. The choices you have between choosing a weapon, choosing its aspects, which boons you find, and which hammer upgrades you get all add up to a huge number of possibilities per run that keeps the game fresh despite its inherently repetitive nature. But this isn't the only strategy used. The second, and probably more obvious strategy to keep the game exciting is its general light speed pace of gameplay. Hades is fast. Very fast. Compare this to a game in the same genre, like, for example, The Binding of Isaac. The Binding of Isaac can get fast, but each new run starts out pretty painfully slow. This can make dying or starting a new run feel a little bit more frustrating than it needs to be. Hades, on the other hand, starts at a blistering pace and gets even blisteringer. Once you start to understand the game, a full run can take a surprisingly short amount of time, especially if you get good boons and good hammers. These short run times go a long way to make deaths feel a little bit less frustrating. You know if you die to a boss, it'll only be a few short minutes before you're back and can try again. The third strategy used by Hades to keep the game's repetitiveness interesting is that the game is actually pretty heavily story-driven, which is something I've never seen in a roguelite before. Usually roguelites and roguelikes as a genre are extremely heavily focused on game design and game design alone. When you look at a game like Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, there isn't a lot of story going on here. There isn't a lot of art going on either. This is pure game design with only a minimal amount of visuals to make the game coherent to look at. Some games go so far as to stop even worrying about being coherent to look at in the first place. But not Hades. Hades has a massive list of supporting characters, all with their own storylines. And since the main character is a god and can't really die, this allows an excuse for the developers to actually progress a storyline and do some pretty interesting things. Most of these characters are also characters from a wide range of classic Greek myths and feature some of the more obscure gods from the Greek pantheon. Achilles is here, Sisyphus is here, Cerberus is here, and some people you might not remember, like Hypnos and Skeleton Man. I have well over 20 hours logged into Hades, and I'm not even remotely close to getting through all of this game's speech options. The amount of dialogue and writing in this game is genuinely bananas for most games, let alone for a game in a genre that generally goes specifically out of its way to avoid character or story development. And Supergiant really went the extra mile by giving it a full voiceover with excellent actors.
Stupid boy. I told you nobody gets out of here, whether alive or dead. So how was your wanton ransacking of my domain?
The character design here also expertly sells the game world. Humans have been writing fan fiction about Greek mythology arguably since the inception of the original myths. For whatever reason, at least in the Western tradition, the Greek mythos still to this day is massively culturally relevant. Maybe it's because the Greek stories went on to inspire the storytelling archetypes of basically every Western author, or maybe it's because we think the names sound cool, or maybe it's because Greek myths are full of animal sex and violence. I'm not sure. People have been studying the writing of ancient Greece for centuries, and there are probably a million different answers. The point is, when you decide to make your game about Greek mythology, you've got to go pretty hard to really own it and make it unique, and Hades does that. Every time you find a god and their art pops up for the first time, along with the voiceover, it feels like it's the definitive version of that god. When I see Ares pop up like this...
You've got quite the fighting spirit in you there, I have to say. Most intriguing, and yet no surprise for someone born in hell itself. You come on out of there and tell me all about it. I'm a fellow student of death, you see.
This is just how he looks now. I don't remember God of War. I don't remember that dumbass movie where all the gods were gold and looked like shit. This is Ares. These are the rules now. The gods themselves also feel like the same kind of insane, petty maniacs they feel like in the myths most of the time as well. In some areas of the game, you'll be offered a choice between boons. The god you don't choose will get pissed and attack you, only to forgive you like nothing even happened, literally seconds later.
You capably survived my wrath, and I commend you for it. Let us continue on, as friends and kin.
During the Theseus boss fight, he will invoke the gods to help him, while he is literally also fighting you, who just got done invoking the gods to help them.
Goddess Athena, lend to me your strength.
They have no loyalties. They are really only helping you escape so they can piss off Hades as a goof. It's extremely Greek. Before I start to get into the game's flaws, I've got one more piece of game design to talk about, which is the underlying progression. Apart from the story progression, the player character also has some stat progression, which is done through this mirror. The mirror uses darkness as a resource, which is something you will collect during runs. Upgrades include an extra dash, extra casts, additional chance to get stronger boons, damage buffs, and that kind of thing. Honestly, the mirror system is a little boring compared to the rest of the game's systems. Basically, while the story progression is great, the actual stat progression is a little shaky. But it still serves the purpose of making the player feel like they're getting stronger, even though the game revolves around dying over and over, and that's all it really needs to do in the context of a roguelike to be effective design. I said I was going to mention the game's flaws next, but this is going to be a pretty short section because of how few flaws there really are. The first and most obvious is just a general lack of content, which should be expected from an early access game to some degree. Enemy variety is a little low. There are only 4 main regions of the game. Boss variety is very low. Some of the weapon aspects, as well as the 6th entire weapon, are missing. As I'm typing this, a new update for the game is scheduled in about 2 weeks, and Supergiant is a very experienced and competent developer that has been continuing to meet their early access goals, so I would imagine that this issue isn't going to last for long. The 1.0 release of Hades is scheduled for this year, so even if you want to wait for a more complete experience, you don't have long. That being said, the game does actively attempt to compensate for this by providing end-game challenge runs that get progressively more and more difficult the more of them you complete and the more rewards you get. I still got over 20 hours out of Hades recording footage for this video, and I will more than likely keep playing it after this video is done for a little bit. So the content is definitely still there, despite some of the missing pieces. The second flaw is a small problem I have with level design in the game's 4th area. Like I mentioned before, the combat in Hades is very fast and designed for the player character to be very mobile and move quickly through fights. In this area, you're confined into tiny-ass rooms with no room to take advantage of the game's movement systems, and it's extremely annoying. In addition, this is also the only area in the game where enemies use poison attacks, which force you to drink Mandrake Gamer Girl bathwater to survive. I hate this. I hate this place. Under normal circumstances, I would never buy or recommend that anyone buy an early access title, and I curse Minecraft every day for creating the early access hell we currently live in. That being said, I'm a man with no principles at my core, and if a developer as competent as Supergiant puts out an early access game as competent as Hades, I'll still endorse it. If you like roguelites, fast-paced combat, Greek mythology, or want to try your hand at insane challenge runs to prove how much of an elite gamer you are, then you'll more than likely enjoy Hades in its current state. If you're still skeptical about early access, the game is set to launch this year, so you won't be waiting for long. If you like this video, consider subscribing. Leaving a like and a comment also helps out a lot. You should also follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.